Another journey on to Jerusalem through the prophecies today, and it looks like we're going to start in Joel. Rabbi, I'm excited.
I am too. God bless you, and God bless you all who are watching us and listening in. I'd like to begin. We spent some time discussing prophecies about the rebuilding, renewal of Jerusalem in Isaiah, segueing into Joel. In particular, the last chapter of Joel. There are different versions with respect to how to divide up Joel into chapters, so I'll call this chapter 4. You might call it chapter 3, but it's the same verses. In verses 16 and on, and the Lord shall roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake. Just to make sure we're on the same page, as it were, in terms of translations, the word that I'm translating as shall roar in the Hebrew, yishag, is precisely the word that we find in the Bible with respect to a lion's roar. Obviously, not implying in any way that God is like a lion. But the consequence, the heavens and the earth shall shake. We're very familiar, of course, with the metaphor for prophecy in Amos chapter 3. Shall a lion roar and the people not be affrighted? So the heavens and the earth will shake. But the Lord will be a refuge unto his people and a stronghold to the children of Israel. That is, the roar is going out from Zion. In Zion, there's a refuge. So shall you know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. Then shall Jerusalem be holy. No strangers shall pass through her anymore. And this, of course, culminates in the final words of Joel, verse 20, but Judah shall be inhabited forever and Jerusalem from generation to generation. What a promise. What a promise for some 2.5 millennia of Jewish and world history when Jerusalem wasn't inhabited, certainly wasn't flourishing. Mark Twain described it as a pauper village. And we've seen the way it looked in the 18th century and even worse in the 19th century until this renewal began. Prophecies, more current than newspapers.
So there's a couple questions that jump out at me, just
great,
discuss.
That's what I'm looking for.
I understand it. It says no alien will pass through it anymore. And so, that's, if you happen to be an alien like me, I think that's an interesting term and something we're talking about.
So I don't think alien is a good translation here. And to dramatize the point, maybe the best way to provide some parallel is we encounter the term that the prophet uses here. In the plural, it is zarim. In the singular, zar. We encounter that in the first chapters of the book of Numbers, in describing the layout of the tabernacle. And there is a principle that is enunciated repeatedly in this description of how the camp of Israel is to be set up, with the tabernacle in its midst. And one instance in Numbers chapter 3, verse 9, there is the imperative that is given to the Levites, to Aaron and his sons, to be taken, as it were, from the people of Israel as a whole. In verse 10, and you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall keep their priest's office. And the stranger, same word here, zar in the singular, the stranger that comes near sounds pretty dire. Shall be put to death. Now, shall be put to death does not mean that he is executed by a terrestrial court. It means that he has committed a mortal crime and he will die at the hand of heaven. And of course, we know what that means. After all, we encountered a dramatic and terrifying example of that back in Leviticus when we read of the dedication of the tabernacle, and just after the description of how the fire comes down from heaven, in Leviticus chapter 9, verse 24, and there came a fire out from before the Lord and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat. And when the people saw, they shouted and fell on their faces. And the next two verses, which are the first two verses of chapter 10. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took each of them his censer and put fire in it and put incense on it and offered strange fire. And we'll note that's also the same word. Zara, here's an adjective in the feminine form, the same root of zar. And offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And fire went forth from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. When we talk about the stranger means even consecrated priests who go where they're not supposed to go and do what they're not supposed to be doing. Now, on the one hand, of course, you could say, well, doesn't that sound awfully dire? Indeed. If the high priest, who is consecrated to enter into the Holy of Holies only on the Day of Atonement, enters into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, but he doesn't follow the specific procedure that is outlined explicitly in Leviticus chapter 16, then we read regarding the high priest in, again, Leviticus chapter 16, in verse 2, the Lord said to Moses, speak to Aaron your brother, that he come not at all times unto the holy place within the veil before the covering which is upon the ark, that he die not. Because if he doesn't follow the right procedure and do it in the proper manner, he's also considered culpable. So we certainly aren't speaking of stranger in some kind of, if you will, generic, let alone, God forbid, ethnic sense. But there is a premise here, not overstepping one's bounds. The premise that we encountered in verse 17, that Jerusalem is holy, is hallowed, means it is not a place of levity. It is not a place that people just kind of mosey into because they felt like going on a tour. But I wouldn't regard it as something that is intended to terrify us, to keep us out of Jerusalem, but to appreciate that Jerusalem is God's holy city.
And to highlight the idea that people are where they need to be and doing what they need to be doing.
Absolutely. And that, of course, inevitably pertains to all of us. You know, I have to admit, in this regard, I should also take notice, because we have an idea in our tradition that Jerusalem of this world isn't the same as Jerusalem of the world to come, because Jerusalem of this world, everyone can enter. In the Jerusalem of the world to come, only those who are invited can enter. So here I am in Jerusalem, and I don't know what's going to be in Jerusalem of the world to come. I have to move. I pray that I'll be worthy of being one of those who is able to enter, but it's not the same as Jerusalem of this world.
Well, I hate to head off on this rabbit trail, but I'm intrigued because I've never knew that things like that would say shall be put to death was something like you would talk about Aaron's sons that the Lord put them to death, and so you said that was a mortal sin, something that would happen like that. You may know that in the book of Acts in the New Testament, there was a couple that the Lord took them out similarly for lying about selling a piece of property, which would appear to be that they committed a mortal sin based on what you're saying about the other. But I was wondering about, are there other examples of, I mean, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but the when David brought the ark up,
I was just going to turn to that. Exactly.
Right.
Uzzah. That
Right.
Uzzah being smitten because of reaching his hand and taking hold of the ark. And the implication, certainly in what we read, is he was doing it with good intentions. He saw that the oxen had stumbled, and he was afraid that the wagon might overturn, and what would happen to the ark? And of course, some people might facilely take that to mean that God doesn't countenance what one's intentions are. And that would be a terrible travesty and a false statement about God. But simultaneously, there are boundary lines. And on some level, what was expected of Uzzah at that moment was to realize what happens with the ark is something that we put in that box marked, this is something for God to take care of. You don't reach. And even though he had good intentions, in this instance, well, we know what road gets paved with good intentions, right?
No, it's like the idea. Gravity is gravity, and you can have great intentions that somehow or another you're going to jump out of that plane and do something wonderful, but gravity is going to bring you down. It didn't take into account. It didn't mean that God wasn't grieved by what happened, et cetera, et cetera. But it's sad. But right. And I suppose just based on that, there are numerous things that are outlined that say you shall be put together death, that you guys know that means a mortal sin of something. How do you?
You're right. That is ultimately, of course, the answer is we have an oral tradition that tells us when this is something that the court needs to adjudicate and when it is not. And as a general rule, in places where it's only, to be very precise here, in the Hebrew, yumat, shall be put to death, that's not an imperative for someone else to be doing it. That's also something that goes into, this is something for God to take care of, box.
Fascinating. That's new information for me. Thank you. You answered the question, but of course it leads to a lot of curiosity. But anyway, the other question I had on Joel was, you said the last words of Joel, verse 20, in the King James Version of our Bible, the last words of Joel is verse 21.
I'm sorry. You're right. You're absolutely right. I wasn't including that. But and
almost the last words. I know.
No, you're right. You're 100% right. And if anything, I should stress, on the contrary, the extraordinary implications of that final verse that I wasn't going to focus upon, but those final words are a whole additional dimension. They don't pertain to the rebuilding of Jerusalem, but they do pertain to a critical message of God having his ledgers and balancing his books. There are a number of ways of translating that final verse. I don't know if we should discuss it right now, but there is the verb literally for cleansing or acquitting. And inevitably, the question is, what's the distinction that is being drawn here? So the first phrase, viniketi, damam lo niketi, can be rendered as, I will acquit those who perpetrated these crimes, but for the blood they have shed, I'm not acquitting anyone. And of course, there are alternatives that I will cleanse everything except the blood. That is that their blood, I'm not cleansing. It is going to stay there as a sign, a symbol that vengeance needs to be exacted. Of course, the final words of that closing verse are, on some level, also a reverting to Zion, because the Lord dwells in Zion. So on some level, when is that final reckoning going to take place? That final reckoning takes place when the Lord will be manifest in Zion.
Well, that's again fascinating. It's a King James, and again, I can see the Christian implication probably that's in this, but it's the way that it was translated. It says, "For I will acquit them of the guilt of bloodshed, whom I have not acquitted." Is the way it reads, and then it says, "For the Lord dwells in Zion." And so this implication in this particular translation would be that there are people that haven't been acquitted until this point, and then they're going to be acquitted.
The problem is, it is the phrase damam lo niketi, I have not cleansed their blood. It's not I haven't cleansed the people. I haven't cleansed the blood. I haven't acquitted those who shed the blood. So I don't know. It could be because I'm just not accustomed to hearing into those terms, but the way the Hebrew reads to me, it's not talking about acquitting those who haven't been acquitted. It's referring to the blood that has not been cleansed or acquitted.
You're right, by the way. I mean, when you look at it in Hebrew, that's what it says. The blood hasn't been cleansed.
Yeah.
Which is another fascinating, idea, as you described. Have to do more study on that. I love it. But you're right. There's no doubt the Lord dwells in Zion. It's very clear how those are the last words of Joel.
And I'll also stress again that we can understand the causative relationship, because the vengeance we don't see in the here and now. And we also don't see in the here and now, maybe we're starting to see, but we certainly don't see fully in the here and now that the Lord dwells in Zion. It's a process. It's a process, and ultimately a righting those wrongs. The recompense to all those who have not been recompensed is likewise not yet complete. And when the Lord dwells in Zion, it will be. I have a little bit of an itch to elaborate on that point a bit further.
Okay.
And that inevitably brings me to considering the last chapter of Zechariah. Now, of course, the last chapter of Zechariah has a very clear, explicit place designation, because it's the final battle of the forces of godlessness fought against God. And where's ground zero? Right here,
right.
Jerusalem. And in particular, when we consider the manner in which this prophecy begins, it's really terrifying. The opening verse, in the standard way that we would render it, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, when your spoil will be divided in the midst of you." That the forces of evil, of godlessness, will vanquish, will conquer Jerusalem. And of course, that obviously is further borne out in what we read in the second verse that follows. "For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into exile, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city." And then, of course, the final battle. "Then shall the Lord go out and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle." But there's an additional dimension that I feel compelled to share. And I have to reveal my heart here. This is something that just came to me in the last few years in considering that opening verse of Zechariah chapter 14. In particular, this phrase that is translated, and translated justifiably, as your spoil will be divided in the midst of you. So indeed, the Hebrew, shalal, conventionally means spoil, and that is an unimpeachable translation of the word. And merely note that shalal does not only refer to spoil. How can I demonstrate that? Well, we can look at the last chapter of Proverbs. The last chapter of Proverbs, in particular, the last 22 verses thereof, are an acrostic in praise of the woman of valor. And if we look in verse 11, which is the second verse of the acrostic, the heart of her husband safely trusts in her. And I think most translations will render the closing clause of the verse, and there will be no lack of profit or gain. I think as the word in the Hebrew is again shalal. And it would make no sense, of course, to render shalal here as spoil. It means, again, gain, profit, even wages. And that inevitably got me thinking about Zechariah chapter 14, verse 1. I'm not coming to say this in order to supplant the conventional translation, which would be that your spoil will be divided in the midst of you because Jerusalem is going to be taken. But on some level, verse 1 is like the banner at the beginning of the whole narrative that follows. So it's kind of like the title of the chapter. The title of the chapter is, "The day is coming when I'm paying my wages to everyone." And what follows is a vivid description of how that plays out. When it is payday before the Lord, with everything that implies. Payday before the Lord means those who thought they could get away literally with murder, with any number of atrocities. It's payday. You're going to get your just desserts. And undoubtedly there'll be people who will flee from this like they would flee from fire, or worse, because it's worse than fire. No, I don't want to get paid. I'm surrendering everything that I did. And of course, it's payday. No. What you did, you will be paid for, with everything that implies. And simultaneously, there'll be all those who didn't do what they did in order to get paid. But God will be saying to them, and I realize this is a potent expression to use, but I'm going to use it anyway. I am your debtor. I need to pay you back. All the stories, even very recent ones, and stories that will go back millennia, of people who did what they did as God's servants. And in this world, there were no wages. There was no shalal. And God says, the day is coming when I'm paying everyone. On that day, we can't even imagine what it's going to look like. Because people who we know acted for the Lord, but in all sincerity, our hearts go out to them because their lives in this world were crushed, were ruined, were ended in the most heinous of ways. And we'll be looking at these people when the Lord pays his debts. Wow. If only we could have had that minuscule payment in this world to reap the wages that the Lord will be paying on that day of reckoning. But of course, it doesn't work that way. We have an old saying in our tradition. It's not biblical, but it certainly is based upon what we read in Exodus chapter 16 about the manna. When you prepare for the Sabbath, you eat on the Sabbath. But if you don't prepare for the Sabbath, what are you going to have to eat on the Sabbath? This world is all preparing for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is that day of judgment, that day of payback. And
as you look at that word, just because I love your thought and I sense your heart, that I would, for those who are familiar with Hebrew, you have a shin and two lameds, and of course everybody hears the shell like shalom, which is where that word starts, and they're very, very close in a way that obviously right after lamed comes mem, and so you see the closeness to completeness. And then
exactly, completeness.
I also think
complete, nothing missing.
Pardon me?
Exactly, complete, nothing missing, 100%.
And then when you look at the first use of that word in the scripture, it's in the prophecy of that he will be a wolf. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. And in the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. And it's almost that, like, and almost for anybody that's, the beauty of that, for anybody living, not just for obviously all of the past, I'm sure there were things that you thought, I didn't get paid fairly for what happened. Like, this ain't right. This just isn't right. And there's all sorts of it isn't rights that happen on both sides. Things that I did that weren't right and things that they did. But in other words, the amazing thing of, like you said, that is the opening. Like you said, that here comes this big statement, and
this is the day of the Lord.
That shalal is, and the implication of those letters and all, that's a spectacular thing he said. And I think it's well worth meditating on and thinking about. And certainly I've never looked at the word spoil that way. And it adds a dimension to it that's beautiful, right?
100%. But since you've already brought us to considering the implications of Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 13, let's go for it.
Okay.
The most basic question that undoubtedly anyone reading Moses' blessings will reflexively ask is, what's the determinant of the order here? That is, the blessing of Benjamin follows immediately on the heels of the blessing for Levi. Well, okay, Levi, we understand, is the third son of Jacob. So on some level, yes, he's going to be near the beginning of this story. We already have the blessings for Reuben and for Judah. And on some level, we can appreciate why they come first. Why Benjamin right after Levi? And on the most basic plane, the answer that we have in our tradition is a very basic fact of geography. Immediately preceding the blessing to Levi was the blessing for Judah. Where is the Holy Temple going to be built? Well, the Holy Temple is built at the border of the precincts of the tribe of Judah. The border of it. But it goes over the border into the precincts of the tribe of, you got it, Benjamin. And since the tribe of the Levites, with the priests within it, is so intimately connected with the goings on in the temple. So immediately before the blessing for the tribe of Levi is the blessing for the tribe of Judah, and immediately afterward is the blessing for the tribe of Benjamin, which is also adjacent to the precincts of the temple, and in particular, just what part of temple precincts protrudes into the precincts of the tribe of Benjamin? Answer: the holy altar. And that this blessing of Benjamin, the beloved of the Lord, he shall dwell in safety by him, he shall cover him all the day long, and shall dwell between his shoulders, which obviously on some level needs to correspond to what we read in Jacob's blessing, which is, of course, the verse to which you referred, is something that pertains to the Holy Temple. And the implications, indeed, of he dwells between his shoulders in our tradition is speaking of the geography and the topography of the Temple Mount. Of course, as we read in Psalm 125, Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains. And anyone who comes to see Jerusalem, as I hope everyone will with in my Holy City tour, and we get that sense of being able to see Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, when we stand on the southwestern hill, which nowadays, as a misnomer for historical reasons, is known erroneously as Mount Zion, and we gaze at the Temple Mount and at the Mount of Olives, and you realize that you have these three ridges, and the lowest of the three is the Temple Mount. You picture the way an ox stands with the head below the two shoulders, and Mount Zion and the Mount of Olives are the two shoulders, and the Temple Mount is in the middle. And God dwells, of course, upon the Temple Mount, as it were, not in any literal sense of geography, but maybe indwells would be a better rendering than dwells. But again, an expression of the temple. And of course, it is inevitably in light of that appreciation that comes from the blessing that Moses gives the tribe of Benjamin that we consider the very last blessing that Jacob gives his children. And the blessing to Benjamin in Genesis chapter 49, verse 27, likening Benjamin to a ravenous wolf, is indeed seen as an allusion to the altar. And the division of the shalal is that it is incumbent upon the priests to divide up the consecrated food that they are obligated to eat as part of the atonement process every evening after the day of the temple service. So it is, on the one hand, it is indeed wages. It is indeed for the purpose of completeness, because it's part of the atonement process for those who brought these offerings to the holy temple that are offered up upon the altar. And of course, inevitably, it is a level of shalal that will bring the priests, the bringers of the offerings, and ultimately the entire world to a greater level of completeness.
What a beautiful outline of that word. And you know, the scriptures just clearly, I mean, it's not, I mean, you have to dig, but when you dig, it's just like, whoa, it lines up so amazing. Like, how is that? And it does. But of course, it always does. And I think we'll spend eternity going, man.
Well, if it were any moral composition, then at some level you could say, well, I'm starting to ask questions that are deeper than the author was thinking. We never have to worry about that in the Bible.
Of course.
And of course, inevitably, when we talk about the significance of the offerings, I know we've mentioned this in the past, but I feel compelled to tag it on here as well, that we also read about the offerings brought upon the holy altar of the Holy Temple. The offerings listed in Numbers chapter 29 that are brought on the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles. 13 bulls the first day, 12 the second, 11 the third, 10 the fourth, 9 the fifth, 8 the sixth, 7 the seventh, and you add them all up, 13 plus 12 plus 11 plus 10 plus 9 plus 8 plus 7, 70. 70, the same number of named offspring of Noah who are listed in Genesis chapter 10. And the implication, certainly this is something that is very well enunciated in our tradition, that the 70 bulls brought on the Feast of Tabernacles, which of course in the Northern Hemisphere is as we segue into the winter, and even though you folks get rain all year round, we only get it during the rainy season, which begins in the winter. And that's the principal season of the blessings coming down from heaven, that there is this atonement offering brought at the brink of the rainy season on behalf of all the nations of the world, that they won't be smitten with desolation. The Holy Temple will be their protection before God, as it were. That aspect of shalal, the positive sense of wages for everyone. But again, of course, that's only temporally in this world. The ultimate day, says God, I'm balancing my ledgers. Payback day is the day of final judgment. And it happens here. And we all come here. And of course, inevitably, we well appreciate that that is likewise explicitly the message that we read just a few verses earlier in Joel.
Before we move on.
Sure, please. By all means.
Well, you mentioned something else that just, I was like, wow. So that number 70 being connected to the nations as it is that also connected in any way to isn't the Sanhedrin 70?
Absolutely. And of course, that's the explicit appearance of the number 70 as the number 70 with respect to the elders who are going to be appointed in Numbers chapter 11. There are 70 elders. The list of 70 archetypal nations is one that we just arrive at by counting.
Right.
The two instances in which we read explicitly about the number 70 in the 5 books of Moses are with respect to the descendants of Jacob coming down to Egypt. That is, we read the reckoning of the names of them all, but we also read the final figure in Genesis chapter 46 in verse 27. Indeed, we read that figure once again at the beginning of Exodus in pages stuck together. Okay. We read the reckoning of 70 souls likewise in Exodus chapter 1 verse 5, and then again of course in Numbers chapter 11 with respect to the 70 elders. It's of course again through arithmetic that we appreciate that there are 70 bulls in Numbers chapter 29. And of what relevance is the significance of the number 70? So one of the great classic commentators on the Bible, Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, who lived in medieval Spain, posits, based upon these various instances in which we encounter the number 70, that the number 70 signifies all possible facets, all perspectives, we have a well-enshrined idea in our tradition, which is not explicitly stated in the Bible, that there are 70 facets of the Torah, which means that there are all different ways in which the Torah needs to be understood and interpreted. And corresponding to the 70 archetypal nations, also 70 languages. Now, what does that mean in practice when we have, I think, over 200 nations in the UN today? Well, in the old days, when our computer monitors were cathode ray tubes, there were 3 guns in back of them. And truth is, it still is true of each and every pixel in our modern day monitors. There is RGB, the primaries, red, green or greenish yellow, and blue. And as long as you have the 3 primaries, you can make every hue in the rainbow. So when it comes to every possible perspective, there aren't 3 primaries, there are 70. Through those 70 primaries, you have the gamut of every possible point of view. Obviously, in the chief court, you need to have every point of view represented. So there are 70 elders. When Jacob and family come down to Egypt, that is the nucleus of the emergent nation. So likewise, every point of view needs to be represented. And of course, similarly, the 70 nations of the world, taken as archetypes, signify every perspective, every dimension, every aspect. Because ultimately, the role of all the nations is, after all, to be, if I may vary the metaphor, the gamut of all the instruments in the grand cosmic symphony orchestra that sings the glory of the Lord. And if there's a perspective that isn't included, then something's going to be missing in the symphony. So you need to have everyone represented. And of course, it's precisely in that vein that we appreciate, and I think we've noted this in the past. Maybe we have, maybe we haven't. But in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, it will come to pass in the end of days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be set at the head of mountains and uplifted above hills, and all nations will stream to it. And of course, on the most pedestrian plane, we appreciate immediately, no, they don't come as Israel. We have no mission to convert the entire world to being Jewish. They came as the nations, but they come here because of the realization that each one has a unique role to play in the grand symphony orchestra. And as a result, note, they come as nations. They don't come as undifferentiated humanity. National groupings have significance. They have significance in this amazing, diversified world of ours, in which everyone has a unique niche to play. Kind of like the organic whole of each and every individual. We aren't a 6-foot-high blob of undifferentiated cells. Indeed, when you have a lump of undifferentiated cells, you call that a tumor. Ouch. Rather, all the cells are organized in unique tissue types, and they are in turn organized in distinct organs, and we're able to function precisely because everything has its place, everything has its role, and so too all the nations, because everyone has a unique perspective, everyone has something unique to contribute. So how is it that we have so many more nations nowadays? Again, from the primaries, you can make all of the hues of the rainbow, all of the secondaries, and there may be many nations that comprise various components that come from any of these various primaries. But the message is still the same. The goal and the role of all of these nations, ultimately, is to be singing the praises of the Lord. Not because God needs to hear them. No, God is, as we well appreciate, not some kind of megalomaniac who needs to be praised. But we need to be praising. We need to be connected with that absolute sense of meaning that has its root exclusively in the absolute, in God.
Oh yeah, it's and from a standpoint of light, because you brought up colors, and it's certainly part of that, right? That I've heard it said, and I love it, that each of us reflect God in a unique way. And if you don't do it, nobody else can, because you were given that to reflect that the way that you can. And if the idea that a nation then also reflects God in a very unique way, like you said in the symphony, it's a beautiful thing. But as an individual, the point is that we have the responsibility, right, to hopefully push into God to where we can get close enough to Him to see the light, so that we can reflect it. And
we always have that within us. We just have to connect with it. That most essentially is what we mean by the soul. The soul is the God bondedness, the divine connectedness that every single human being has. We can turn our backs on it. We can even starve it. But it's there. In our morning prayers every day, we have this line, my God, the soul that you put within me is pure. Not was pure. Not could be pure. Not should be pure. It is pure. Because that God bondedness can never be sullied. I can sully myself. And because I am this conglomerate whole that includes my soul, I can even drag it down, but I can't actually corrupt it, because that God bondedness is necessarily there as long as I live. And that's true of every individual and also every nation. Yes, we believe nations also have souls. This is perhaps most explicit in Daniel, where we read about the Tsar, the heavenly officer of Greece, of Persia, of Israel. Every nation has a soul. That means that every nation has a role to play in connecting with God, in, as you express it, Pastor Robbie, reflecting that light. Yes, that is a summons from each of us. Unfortunately, it is like every summons that God gives us, something we can turn our backs on it. But it's still there. And it still is forever summoning us home to return to our Father, which of course is Teshuvah.
yeah, that's that I think we did good on Zechariah 1. Well, there's
14.
much more to come undoubtedly, but it's pretty fun to see what is in those verses, and the connections to so many other places in the Bible and so many other things and concepts. But in the essence of, I guess, being at a good stopping point, I guess this might be, for today's discussion. We undoubtedly have covered a lot of ground in a lot of different places, but maybe there's something else you would like to get said before we close out today.
I think that this is really a good place for us to pause. We only pause. We never stop. We only pause because the idea that you expressed, that each of us is summoned to be in our lives a reflection of God, is so absolutely key. And of course, this always brings us back to the theme of the greatest gift that God gives us, human responsibility. Because the obvious corollary of recognizing that each of us is summoned to be a unique reflection is, if we don't do it, then something is missing. If one of the instruments in the symphony orchestra is silent, then the symphony is incomplete. If there is an aspect of God's presence that we need to reflect in the world and someone doesn't do it, then there's something dark in the world that should have been lit up. And that more than anything else, I think is really what needs to guide us in recognizing this extraordinary opportunity and concomitant with it, of course, the responsibility. Because God has so much faith in us. We just need to have faith in him and also faith in ourselves, as God has given us the wherewithal to act as his proxies in this world.
Which actually, and again, in closing up, as we've talked about today, Jerusalem. And again, I think it's, as we pray for Jerusalem, as we think about Jerusalem, but also as we mourn for Jerusalem. Clearly what you've illustrated today, Rabbi, better than I've ever heard it illustrated in my life. And I hope some people got out of it all that and even more than we could possibly illuminate, is that this is where all this is going to happen. And so part of the mourning is all the nations that need to get the picture, all the people that need to get the picture. But oh my gosh, in order for it to be all that it will be, it's a place of mourning, of like you always talk about, missed opportunities, and making sure we're honed in on that. But it's a beautiful opportunity to really fall more in love with Jerusalem as we look to what it will be, but also our role in helping it, even through our mourning and through our prayers.
Absolutely, 100%. And maybe the only words I'd like to say to supplement this thought is, yes, of course, we mourn the missed opportunities, because every opportunity is simultaneously a responsibility for us to seize upon it. But sometimes, miraculously, God grants us that the opportunity comes back. And at the very least, for us to be so careful that when he grants us this miracle and the opportunity does indeed return, that we will have learned our lesson and make sure we don't squander it a second time. Yeah. And of course, I feel compelled to add here. I feel with you, Pastor Robbie, that's what we're doing. This podcast is precisely part of that. That is, in this world, we're not going to know exactly what happened 2,000 years ago. But God is giving us an opportunity now to stand together for his glory. And that's the greatest gift. And we sure don't want to have to wait another 2,000 years. Again, God forbid, wrong this time around. So we make our efforts, as God chose the way, to appreciate this humongous gift that he has given us. We stand together, shoulder to shoulder, as in the words of Zechariah, chapter 3, verse 9, to proclaim a message, and may it reverberate around the world. It's God's message through his words. And that's just so exquisitely transformative in readying the world for that day of the Lord with which we began today.
Amen. Amen. In Jerusalem.
Exactly. Indeed.
Shalom.
Shalom, Pastor Robbie. Keep warm in your storm. We got the sun shining here. And God's blessings from his holy city. Shalom.